At Trimble, we care about connection. Connecting technology, connecting solutions, connecting you. We're developing an ecosystem for transportation professionals that improves every facet of moving freight. Whether you need to improve safety, efficiency, or compliance, Trimble has you covered with telematics and fleet management, route optimization, asset maintenance, and transportation management. Wherever you're headed, your journey starts with Trimble.
Welcome back to another episode of Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson. The topic for today is going to be tenders. Not chicken tenders, dear friend, but load tenders. Depending upon the size of your company, you can get access to load tenders. A tender can come in many forms, not breaded or deep fried, but it could be sent via email, electronically, EDI, API, a lot of different ways. I don't think they mail them anymore, nor do they have the little terminals that you could get your tenders from. But we're talking about tenders because it's one of the fundamental parts of freight. Before you get a load, you get tender to load. You got to win the load. So managing those tenders is probably one of the most important things you can do, because if you make the customer angry who sends you the tenders, well, no more tenders. By the way, we just made a record of saying tenders the most in an episode of Loaded and Rolling. But we're going to welcome back the folks of Freight Science. Got to speak with Matt Foster, the CEO of Freight Science, a little while back about AI, but today it's all about load tender acceptance levels. Matt, it's fun to talk to y'all again. Y'all are cooking up some really cool stuff over there. Getting to touch base again, tell us about a little bit about yourself for folks who don't know and what Freight Science does.
Yeah, sure. And it's great speaking with you again as well. And candidly, you made me kind of hungry because I haven't had lunch yet. And I would almost rather talk about regular tenders in this market than freight tenders. But so my name is Matt Foster, founder, CEO of Freight Science. Started the company back in 2019. Obviously, an interesting time right prior to COVID happening. And the very first problem set that we actually tackled from an optimization standpoint was what we refer to as freight intake optimization. But it's actually the tender acceptance problem. And but we effectively implement artificial intelligence and optimization solutions into existing TMSs to help trucking companies build more scalable companies and ultimately make more profitable decisions all the way through the workflow.
And one thing I like about especially your tech stack is because it does feel like when I try to talk to people about trucking, there's one whole side of trucking that doesn't understand tender management because you just get one load a day and you run that load. And that's kind of all I need. But then there's another side of the equation where I have 1,000 loads and I need to figure out the tender problem. Tell us about the origins. What is the tender management, tender acceptance, the tender problem? Because it definitely feels like it's something that in this space, it can really trip you up if you're not aware of it.
Yeah, it's actually wildly fascinating in the sense that, we do all of these things to architect a network. And we think that these are our engineered lanes. We think that these are the lanes that we run consistently. And really, the network is what the tenders on any given day say that they are. So you have an extraordinarily dynamic problem that people on the front end are trying to understand, but they're also responsible for managing a customer or a region. So they've got a smaller view of the world. And this single decision dictates what the network is going to be for the coming days and weeks. And that also includes pretty much everything that focuses on revenue and cost for a business. It's the single largest decision in an organization when it comes to profitability.
Picking the right load. I had that same problem when I did network design for a carrier. We had the same issue. What's a good tender? What's a good load? What's a good lane? And when we're looking at the capabilities of accepting the tenders in the first place, what's kind of the landscape right now? Because I feel like we go from the Stone Age to the Space Age, depending upon the size of your carrier and your capabilities.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't even know if that necessarily depends on size anymore. I see a lot of mid-sized companies who are more progressive in their way of thinking and adopting technology. You have a lot of large ones who are in the we've got to get back to basics. So it's all across the board in terms of who's thinking about these types of problems and applying them. But there's people will say in this market, well, we take pretty much everything, and because the volumes are so far down. But what people don't recognize is pretty much everything, even a few percentages in the decision making, has such a material difference from a percentage standpoint on the outcome on the bottom line, that it really is almost market agnostic. If you're not taking absolutely 100% of your volume, and the question also should be, should you ever take 100% of your volume if you're not going to make money off of it? But those are the things that people now need to be considering at the time of a transaction on every single tender, as opposed to looking and saying, what did we do 2 weeks ago, and why the heck did we do that?
And that's a hard scenario because the customers, I remember a lot of them would want 95%, some would want 99% tender acceptance rate. So you're almost in this scenario where if you're not prepared, you don't have the technology to tell you what a good tender is, you could be making these mistakes and then you're stuck with them, or else the customer may pull the load you actually want.
Yeah, and that's fascinating as well, because you thinking about it from a contract side, and for us, the tender acceptance piece started with contract management. And we found that a lot of carriers didn't have an ideal way of managing the existing contracts. So if you look at commitment realization right now across the board for our carriers, it still hovers in the low 40%. And with your background in network design, you're trying to typically commit around 100 to 120% of your capacity contractually. And when you're only seeing 40%, your network is completely different than what you would expect it to be on any given day. So part of the question needs to be from a company standpoint is, and even in a dialogue that needs to be had with the customer, if we're being held to 95% tender acceptance, but we're only receiving 40%, is that fair to hold us accountable at the lane level to do those types of things? The other dialogue is that 95% the first 95%? If we get 10 tenders, do I need to take the first 10? Or if we know that we're going to get 15 over the course of that week, do we get to selectively pick and choose those tenders? And I think we need to be a lot more strategic in the way that we look at contracts and have dialogue with our customers. And that will help us into better understanding of even the blocking and tackling of tender acceptance.
I think that's such a great point. I've had it happen before where we would have customer service reps were instructed, take everything up until this point, but then the customer changes the day. And so they took it all at the beginning, exactly. But the one the customer wanted was like, oh, well, that was the one on Thursdays. And so how do you even tackle that as a carrier? Like, I just took all these. Why are you telling me about this now?
Yeah. Look, these are very strategic internal conversations. Because at some point when you're saying, we're going to have to prioritize some business decisions over others. Are we going to make profitable decisions, or are we going to do everything and beholden to a specific shipper? And those are things that are really tough internally, especially when you're on the front line as a customer service rep or an account manager, and you have to receive phone calls from said customer about why you are no longer doing a thing. But understanding fundamentally if a load is profitable for you, and also which day it best fits your network, is the foundation for being able to have more informed conversations with the customer about what your expense side looks like, and then also what your network looks like.
I think that's a great point. I remember being in the shoes where I had to tell the customers, hey, it's not your day. And then it wasn't me. It was the customer service rep who got yelled at. And then their manager comes to me and they're like, oh, Thomas, you need to prioritize this load. And I said, well, you accepted double your allotment for the week. You were supposed to get 10. You took 20. They get rolled. And then they say, well, we're going to lose this lane. I was like, well, I've got 5 other. I think that's something interesting. And you brought up as well, 40% of what should have been sent is only being sent, not that 100%. Does it ever feel like, as you're developing this tech, that both sides, the shipper and the carrier, whether it's a broker or a motor carrier, we kind of hold the cards back a little bit, and they won't tell you unless they gave it to another down the line, or if they really had no product. And at the same time, I'm not always telling them why I decided to not pick up their crap.
Yeah, no doubt. And I just got back from one of our customers' shipper events, and some of these conversations came up, and especially around collaboration. So there's definitely on both sides of the table some of that going on. One of the more interesting things that I've seen happen in this market is we have a carrier who focused on putting a lot of automation in, and then turning kind of the inside CSR account management role into kind of a pseudo inside sales organization. and they were just calling customers repetitively and asking about their committed volumes. And they were actually able to track down and now have the highest tender volume as a percentage of assets, as well as the highest commitment realization from just chasing down commitments. My belief was always that if they weren't being tendered to you, they weren't there. Those lanes weren't there. Those volumes weren't there. And in this specific instance, they were going out to spot. They were going to other carriers. Even though they were primary and contractual, they weren't seeing those volumes. And I'm not indicting all shippers on those types of activities, but it certainly happens. And being able to, again, kind of chase those volumes down when they've been what is the backbone of your network is incredibly important.
That is fascinating, because I felt when we had the same issues, we would look at our weekly KPIs. We'd notice a customer is at 50, 60% in terms of their commitments, but we never had the idea to have like a freight detective, because we always just took at face value that
Right.
there just wasn't enough product. That's interesting. Was there anything that you can discuss? Was there any tells? I know that the used to be, as a broker, we had to hide our cities because the customer would tell if we put it on spot when they didn't want to put it on spot.
Yeah, and these are obviously sensitive conversations because both sides, and there's competing values. Like trucking companies want to be as profitable as possible, and shippers want to reduce costs as much as possible. But yeah, there's absolutely tells. I mean, some of them is, you see other brokers hauling through your lanes. I cannot tell you how many times we've seen third-party brokerages who will actually tender the load that one of our carriers is supposed to be a primary on for that lane. So you start to see a lot more behavior like that from specific shippers.
That's happened to me before. That makes so much more sense. I swear, I had 2 or 3 analysts. So we would have the CSRs that would handle the frontline tenders, but we had analysts who would work with brokerages on spot. And then they'd make a deal with the broker and it's the exact same lane, preload, drop, and hook, and we just happen to be running it. And I'm thinking to myself, wonder if that's all the volume. That's a fascinating, especially in this market. So kind of looking at how to handle this market condition, it does appear that you're a carrier, you got a double whammy. I'm not getting tendered enough. They don't feel like they have to. They want to save costs. What are some of the other tactics and strategies as you all have this technology developed? How do you fill this bucket when it feels like the fields are barren?
Yeah. So one is, there are the opportunities the way we work is we forecast volumes into the future. And we are essentially saying, where should we allocate our assets in the network where we're going to have the least empty miles and the highest revenue opportunities to do it? It's paired with all of the commitments to make sure that people are able to then make a business decision of, do we make the profitable decision or do we adhere to our committed volumes? And then from there, we know that there are gaps in the network. So those gaps are specific lanes. What a lot of folks are struggling with right now in this market is they will accept to fix an origin problem, and then you end up bouncing around on third-party brokerage load, as opposed to being back on shipper freight. So our entire objective is to keep our trucking companies running on their customer freight as much as possible by informing them where those missing nodes in the network are going to be. The second part of the strategy is, and this is where the industry has always leaned into relationships, it's time to do that. So we've helped companies build scorecards out to sit down and have the conversations about the volumes they're missing, the volumes they're not getting, how they can work better together. And they really need to understand and treat it as, this is a book of business. And what we're trying to get out of this relationship is a mutual financially favorable outcome. And the way that you do that is by essentially keeping us in business, keeping us profitable, because if we go away, so does a large portion of your network. And I think shippers are more and more open to that, especially as spot rates, as I saw, I believe, from FreightWaves last week, were starting to hover around below operating cost consistently for trucking companies.
And that's like the all-in one as well, is what's rough. I do have a
Crazy.
theory I want to run by you, because prior to the questions we sent over, obviously we've got port strikes, potential disruptions, all that jazz. One of the ones is private fleets, because some of the large customers in the for-hire space, like if I'm a Covenant, US Express or something, sometimes I don't get all my commitments because maybe a customer like a Walmart or a Target is putting it more on private fleets. Is there ever instances where you're seeing it where you have to talk to them, and instead of them giving it to a broker, they're like, hey, my private private fleet's hungry. I know I'm supposed to give you this lane, but my trucks have to keep moving.
Yeah, and I think it's just degrees of what's acceptable in terms of business practice there. And what I mean by that is, we have to. Where would you rather it be? Would you rather see them selling it to somebody else when it's your business, or would you rather see it say, "Hey, that's no longer a lane that we need capacity on because we're able to service that internally"? But in that situation, again, I think that the dialogue is, well, these are the other missing parts in our network. If you've made the selective choice to take away something that we had previously agreed upon, are there these other parts of your network that we can then consider backfilling them with at X price, which gets this whole again? And it really needs to be that partnership level discussion as opposed to, and I don't think anybody wants to be treated transactionally anymore. I think shippers are moving away from that conversation as well. So that gets you more into the conversation of, let's be real partners in this. Understand your private fleet needs to run more profitably, but to do what we said we were going to do mutually, there's got to be other opportunities out here.
I think that's one of the big keys. You identify the customers that are willing to invest in you. I've had a few automotive and tire customers, love them to death, but they hoard my trailers. They use them as storage. I'd have the same issues. Yeah. They wouldn't tender. But I do wonder, looking at the Freight Science platform, optimizing a network, looking for opportunities, finding tenders, is that something where as well, if I have an instance where I have a sudden cutoff because of a supply chain delay, is that where I need to step in and the technology can help me backfill without chasing freight? Because that's what I've seen before. I've done it before too. Give Donnie Gilbert a hard time. He used to send him to like Montana. And it's like, Donnie, we can't book him out. We put 25 assets in Montana chasing freight, and that whole asset's out of network now, and it's just in some wombo zone. But talk a little bit about that, because I feel like there's an opportunity with this platform that you are able to help guide these right decisions, because my biggest fear is, of course, either you're going to be competing a lot more on the spot from hungry fleets because we're having this problem.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant question. And it's brilliant because, to your point of the ports, the value of the forecast model is that it picks up on these trends and where your volumes are going to be originating from. So where the decision previously would have been said and stuff to these East Coast areas where we know there's going to be outbound volumes coming back, we now know that those things are going to be gone. So instead of making the bad decision up front and having to redirect it, it's going to make the best of the next best option in the network to make sure that it stays balanced and the trucks are running around on your freight. And then also, are we going to need to augment that someplace else? And candidly, if we see a massive freight dip over the next couple of days, weeks, I think everybody's going to be struggling, regardless of the technology you have. We can tell you what you need and where you need it, but sometimes if it's just not there, it's just not there. So that's always becomes the really difficult conversation that's happened internal to asset-based companies is, do we continue to run trucks at a loss? And if so, for how long? Or do we decide to make a strategic decision to park a little bit of capacity where we can keep our network and our company profitable?
That's one of the things I've been curious about, because it's a great conversation today because load tenders. And the most important thing that we may see, if there are disruptions to the tenders, you have to have a plan. You need a tertiary plan. You need to see where you can reroute your fleet. As we're looking ahead here, I think one of the biggest challenges with acceptances and how to mitigate it is finding ways around with it. Some of your thoughts looking at moving ahead into 2025 as well. If all things are working, is there even a way to predict? Like if I'm on an RFP right now, or I'm thinking ahead in my network, is there anything I really need to think about? Can I afford to look that far out when potentially in the next quarter we may have weeks of I'm going to have that mismatch in tenders because I'm not getting the upstream that I need, or somewhere along the chain I'm lacking?
Yeah.
And looking ahead.
So yeah. And I think the RFP part is definitely important, and strategically looking at what your network is and what it should be. But the reality is, as I mentioned, we're at 40% commitment realization. Nobody architects a network thinking that these random 40% lanes are going to materialize. So it's really so much more of a dynamic world. Is how do we make sense of the dynamic nature of the network? For example, everything's shutting down on the East Coast this week. And where do we do things tomorrow, next day, next 21 days moving forward? And then realizing that that's going to change over days, over time, with a specific tender volume that comes across, because regardless of how good the bid looked and what we saw come back from it, that's typically not what we end up recognizing.
And that was a cool thing from the last conversation here. Well, we got about 5 minutes left. Was that you talked about how the AI can help you evaluate your awards. And so, do you think there's a potential? Because I could see a pump fake. If I was, and this is where I miss being in the game when I was in operations, I miss that when you see that there's a big negative 200 from this customer mix because they're port exposed or something. What do I do? Because my biggest fear is what if it resolves quickly, but now I've cut out that volume from my network, already took other commits, other special projects or something else. Is there any kind of that game theory that you want eventually maybe the technology can help me with where it's like, well, Thomas, we could tell you what happens when this drops, but if it picks back up, you're going to have to like pull some other strings.
Yeah, for sure. And you can simulate that. But there's a lot more that goes into that than just simulating the what's going to happen in the future network. I mean, one giant component that's missed out is customer sensitivity. And if you make that temporary change, how does your shipper view you when it comes to other lanes and when it comes to wanting to have the strategic conversations? So, for me, going back to the relationship side, I think we really need to start meeting in the middle on these types of things and having the discussion of these volumes are going to go away. So we're considering doing these other things and open up the dialogue to them as opposed to just getting out of it altogether, going to run something else for a short term game. I think that if you have the honest conversation, people understand more than they don't.
Yeah, that's what I'd be sending the outside sales rep and having those conversations, being like, look, we got to smooth this over. Are they more sensitive now in your experience? Are customers, because since I did it in 14, some customers are cool, you can talk with them. Some are only price sensitive. Is there a trend right now that you're observing?
So, and again, coming off the back of being at a shipper summit where I got the fortunate opportunity to sit down with a bunch of very large shippers and talk about what collaboration means. And and again, kind of going back, the collaboration for me when organizations have competing values, I always thought was kind of a pipe dream. But what tended to happen is that people recognize, there's giant opportunities for operational expenses to be reduced on both sides of the equation. And those are tremendous opportunities. And there's also some things going on right now around sustainability that people are starting to take very serious, where those conversations are out there to be had. So, a long way of answering your question is I think that there's some genuine dialogue to be had about what networks look like, what using real information and data to support them, and what lanes you need. How do we make our business profitable, which makes us both more sustainable? Our empty miles go to your ESG objectives. All of those types of things, which again, just take the relationship to a different level than being transactional. And we provide a box for you to move materials in.
I like the ESG component. I'm waiting for the salespeople to realize you can, like SmartWay is one of those examples where it's like, hey, I know my scope 3 emissions. Give me more freight. I'm slightly more expensive, but I'm doing the work for you. Is that like the next step? Because if I'm a trucking person, I'm thinking, well, it's a tough time right now, but farm to fresh, I got a sticker.
It really depends. And it depends on in some shippers, unfortunately. And look, I think we need to do everything we can for climate change. Some people say not real. Some people say it's real. Wherever you stand politically, I don't care. But at the end of the day, I think we can do things to stop throwing 450 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere every year as an industry. So, some shippers take it very seriously. Some, it's lip service, it's part of a bid, but they don't necessarily care. So it really depends on where the shipper falls in terms of that. Are they necessarily getting, and I think one thing that companies haven't really figured out how to do well in this industry yet is actually capture carbon credits, which would be your cost offset. But I don't think that people have really figured that out yet. And when we do, and the companies are well positioned to your point, measure scope 3 emissions and discuss how their network impact can improve that, there's a tremendous opportunity there.
I like it. Folks want to learn more about freight science. Running out of time, but always a pleasure to have you on. Tons of stuff we got to go over. If folks want to learn more, read what y'all have been up to, find out, what's the best way to get in contact?
Yeah, freightscience.com. Also, obviously, everybody kind of lives in the LinkedIn world now. So finding any of us in LinkedIn, and we just enjoy the conversation. We enjoy the industry, and we're really here to make trucking companies as successful as possible, regardless of the market. So just love conversations like these and people like you for continuing them.
I love getting to talk shop as well. So we're going to have you on again soon. There's going to be a lot more to talk about with tenders depending upon which way this thing goes. So Matt, pleasure to have you on the show. Looking forward to getting touching base soon.
All right, take care.
That's going to be a wrap for today's show. But if you're just missing us, Apple, YouTube, Spotify, join us next week, 2 p.m. Eastern. Do it live.